How ironic. The most anarchic Jesuit in this community preaching on today's gospel. Clearly God or the organizers of the liturgy, or perhaps both of them, have a sense of humor. I think the only way we need to read this Gospel of Matthew is by reading the parts that have just gone before. Matthew 5, the Beatitudes. A very daring exposition of Jesus' teaching. Very hard-hitting, very challenging. Stuff that I suspect some would have heard with a mixture of shock, horror, and perhaps even a little bit of guilt. This passage at the end of that great discourse is a reminder to us, as it is a reminder to those of his disciples who may have had a little bit of shock, horror, or guilt, that Jesus was not saying anything new. In fact, he was summing up the law and the prophets. If you look back into the prophetic tradition of Israel, the kinds of things that Jesus speaks about are the kinds of things the prophets spoke about. Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the whole crew. So in a sense, it's nothing particularly new. And the great danger, I think, when we read it, is that we develop a kind of fixed and static understanding of the law. And those of a particularly scrupulous disposition might then head back and go through all the rules and regulations and say, do these apply to me? You mean I can't have prawns? I can't have pork? I can't have steak and a cup of coffee afterwards because of mixing of milk and meat? And various others that can carry on like that. And we all know in practice 90% of those laws in Leviticus we ignore. Not because they don't matter, but because in many ways they may have been created at a time when there was a need. We all know how easily pork gets contaminated. You need proper freezing, refrigeration. You've got to cook it right. Then it's wonderful. Otherwise it could be very dangerous. That's just one example. So maybe practical things, as well as broader moral things and religious things, will all jumble together into that list. And the danger, I think, when we read a law, is that we think that it's written down, therefore it must be followed. But all laws in every society are interpreted. All laws have to be balanced. And quite often, even when you deal with a problem case, you have 2 or 3 different laws conflicting with each other. In civil cases, in criminal cases. And I would go so further to say in religious questions. We have this great body of law that the gospel is telling us is Jesus' law, and he has no plans in changing it. How do we interpret law? I think before we make a judgment, we have to ask ourselves, what purpose and how we interpret law. You know, you can interpret it in a narrow sense, being literal. And then, as I'd point out, you can't have coffee after you've had steak. Or you can interpret it from a practical point of view. about health, about the well-being of a community, about what is available and what's not available. We can interpret it. Now, of course, there's one way of interpreting it that is very casuistic. And some casuistry is so bad that it can, justify the absolute opposite. But good thinking, good, clear legal thinking, helps us to discern behind what the law says, what it means. What are the intentions? And in a sense, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is all about what are those intentions behind the laws. Read that way, quite clearly Jesus says, no, none of this will change. And I think it also helps to remind us that Jesus was Jewish. He lived according to the Torah. So often I fear we jump over the Old Testament and we go straight to the New Testament, which is a pity because we miss a lot of very interesting things we can learn from if we apply them. It's all about application. How do we observe Lent? Do we do it in a kind of narrow, legalistic way? Or do we do it in a sense of saying, this is the opportunity for me to grow in my relationship with God and my neighbor? And what will help me? And what will hinder me? I tell this story against myself. Once upon a time, I was in a particularly strong state of religious fervor. Yes, those who know me well, I do have those occasions. And I decided I was going to give up smoking for Lent. 2.5 weeks into Lent, a number of members of my community said, for God's sake, Anthony, smoke, please. I said, why? They said, you're as miserable as hell, please stop it. The point I make, not in defense of smoking during Lent, but realism, although, let's be honest. The point I would make is that if you follow something rigidly to the point where it consumes you, you lose perspective. I wasn't even aware that I was as grouchy as could be, but everyone in my community knew. And they were saying, oh, please stop it. And I stopped. So I had a bad Lent in one respect, but the Lent for the rest of my community improved substantially. How do we interpret the law? I think we interpret the law not through the letter, but through the spirit. In what spirit is a law written? Is it a spirit of inclusion or exclusion? Is it a law that is written to privilege a few and harm the many? Or is it aimed at giving everybody a fair deal? That's the challenge. That's the question we have to ask. So as we prepare ourselves to celebrate the Eucharist today, as we prepare to celebrate Easter in 2 weeks' time, 2-3 weeks' time, spend a bit of time thinking about how do I interpret the law, civil law, church law, Jesuit law. Do I interpret it in a way that benefits me? Do I interpret it in a way that serves its purpose? Building people up, building up community, building up the Society of Jesus, building up our religious congregations, whatever form, whatever name we live under. Building up the church, building up God's reign in our own small, partial, and very haphazard way. I think if we do it that way, if we try and see what God wants, not what I want, or what some institution wants, or from what some sort of elite might want within a state or society or community. I think we are fulfilling the law even as we interpret it. And I think in doing that, we don't just fulfill the requirements, we deepen the spirit in which laws are made. And we discern how the Lord is calling us to greater service, to greater love, to greater community, to greater ministry. Let's pray then today for the gift of discernment as we follow the law.